Friends, I think there is an altar in every heart marked unknown. Some fill it with anxiety, some with control. Paul doesn't demolish that altar, he reinterprets it. The Christian claim is not that mystery disappears, but rather that mystery has drawn near.
That's Reverend Dr. Scott Rennie, and today he brings you a message entitled The Unknown God. I'm Katie Givens-Keim. Welcome to episode 4233 of Day 1. Welcome to Day 1, the weekly program that brings you outstanding preachers from America's historic Protestant churches, sharing insight and inspiration from God's Word for your life. Hello, friends. I'm your host, Reverend Dr. Katie Givens-Keim, and today on Day 1, we have a good one. We're honored to welcome Reverend Dr. Scott Rennie, a Church of Scotland pastor leading St. Giles Cathedral, the flagship church of Presbyterian Scotland, located on the Royal Mile in Edinburgh. Before being called to St. Giles last year, Scott served congregations in Angus, Aberdeen, and London. Scott studied geography and divinity at the University of Aberdeen, and later he held the prestigious Scots Fellowship at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Reverend Dr. Scott Rennie of St. Giles, my goodness, welcome to Day 1.
Thank you, Katie. Great to be here.
Okay, I just have to ask the big obvious question. You preach every week from a pulpit so closely tied to history, Christian history, the Scottish Reformation. So how does this long history of the pulpit you preach from, how does it shape how you preach or constrain how you preach and your imagination for the church today?
Yes, it is a very historic pulpit. It is obviously the place of the Scottish Reformation, but also part of the European Reformation. And it's difficult to be in that pulpit and not feel it every day, actually. It's interesting. It is a very historic pulpit, and St. Giles is a place where national life, civic life, royal life, community life, all of that, but also centuries also of dispute and discussion and discerning all come together in that place. And the strange thing is, Katie, in that very traditional and historic place, there is also space for radicalism. And in this very traditional form of high Presbyterian worship, it is also a good covering spot for quite radical theology and ideas. It's amazing what you can get away with in a traditional church and pulpit. But that's the nature of the place, because the Reformation itself was, especially in Scotland compared to other parts of the United Kingdom, was hugely radical.
Yes, radical, conflictual, and it's easy to forget it too when you're amidst the glory and the beauty of all the history. Just what an overturning it was of things. It just overturned everything. The
way I would think about it is it was a bottom-up Reformation. So instead of, often we think about reform in societies coming from people at the top who sort of deigned to roll it down to people. Where in Scotland, and to be fair, even before the Reformation, the understanding of authority and the understanding of kingship, in fact, was the sense that more in Scotland than, say, in England, that the king was chosen and that ruled by consent. So you had this perfect political environment for a Reformation that was really radical in that it was bottom up.
Yeah.
That Christ is king, not the civic ruler, and, the church belongs to its people. And so that remains a very large part of the Church of Scotland. The other thing about being here at St. Giles is you are constantly reminded, in a world even that is more secular and where people imagine faith doesn't matter, in actual fact, at St. Giles, when you're surrounded by constant public ceremonial, that actually faith is not private, it is very, very public. And actually that all of this matters.
Yeah.
You know, faith matters. Christianity still matters. People still look at it. They still see it. And even if we're in a sort of post-Christian environment, it's only post-Christian to a certain extent. The church still, at least here, has many privileges. And I think it's really important that we use what privilege we have, one, to bring other people into the conversation about what is a good society, but also, I think, to recognize the opportunity we have still to be that engine of radicalism that is the gospel.
So for those for whom the name John Knox is not familiar, can you just succinctly tell us, who was John Knox?
John Knox was essentially a Roman Catholic priest who was one of the party who wanted reform. And eventually, as we know in history, they were not able to reform from within, and he had to go in exile to France. He ended up in Geneva with Calvin. He took the model of Calvin's Geneva back to Scotland when he came back from exile, by which time the nobility in Scotland had decided, influenced by Reformation pamphlets and literature coming across the North Sea from the continent, that the church in Scotland should be reformed. And he arrived back to a Scotland that was ripe for his preaching, ripe for the Reformation. And because he'd gone to Geneva and liked what he saw in Calvin, he essentially had a model, quite a radical model of Reformation with him when he returned. And he was the charismatic character who was able to pull it off effectively, among others.
What do you think John Knox would think if he walked in the door today? What would he love and what would absolutely shock him?
Oh, Katie, I just would be terrified to know, if I'm being honest. I think, look, Knox is a man of his time, but if you could transcend Knox from his social mores and history, I hope he would be pleased at the ecumenical nature of worship at St. Giles. I think he might not like the fact there's a great big statue of him sitting in the church. That might appear to him to be somewhat idolatrous. But, so I pass him every day on the way into my vestry. So I think a lot about him. Funny. It's funny you should ask that question, because I do think a lot about him, and I do often think, now, what would John Knox say? But on the other hand, you know what? He did the best in his time. We have to do the best in our time. We can't be him. He can't be us. But I do hope that he would know that we are engaged in Christian faith and thinking about what it means in the time and the context we live in practical ways, in intellectual ways, but also in ascetic ways, as I try to refer to in my sermon.
So at day one, formerly the Protestant Hour, we represent 81 years of broadcasting the voice of American Protestant preaching. So I'm going to give you a caricature, and I want you to tell me how true it is. John Knox, and then thus Presbyterianism, is largely responsible for what became representative democracy.
I think that's fair, and particularly when you think of the American Constitution, the whole idea of a separation of powers, for example, really comes out of the Scottish Reformation. The idea that on one, you have the spiritual realm and the church, and it shouldn't be interfered with by the state, but also that you have the secular environment, you have the civic magistrate, and they too should not be interfered with by the spiritual realm, that they are separate, and that people have to be trusted with representation. And I think that is just a cornerstone of the Scottish Reformation, and still is a cornerstone of the Scottish psyche, really.
When people say that we are living in a secular age or that we are living in post-Christendom, I think it's really important to look to, say, something we see as very secular, which is representative democracy, and to see how there's Christian theology baked in there, for better or for worse.
Absolutely. I mean, I think secularism is a fruit of the Reformation.
Absolutely.
And actually, rather than mourn it, we should rejoice in it, because it actually stops the state being the tool of any particular doctrinal or covenantal group who believe they have God in their box. I mean, we see what theocracy has done through world history. We can see it in some countries today, the kind of oppression that happens of ordinary people because people at the top believe they have God in their box and there's no room for anybody else. And of course, they abuse that power. What secularism allows, actually, is a civic space of free debate and discernment. And also, it is really up to the community of faith to share faith. It is not the job of the state. And sometimes, and this is the honest truth, Katie, sometimes the state, certainly in the United Kingdom, has protected some Christians from other Christians because of secularism. Mm-hmm. So you think about issues such as LGBT rights, or you think about the place of women in society. It is the secular state that has often been at the foremost of change and actually protected some Christians from other Christians in civic society. And actually, I think that's a good thing.
Now, listen for God's word as we hear from the book of Acts, chapter 17, verses 22 through 31.
Then Paul stood in front of the Areopagus and said, "Athenians, I see how extremely spiritual you are in every way. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription, 'To an unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, he who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. From one ancestor he made all people to inhabit the whole earth, and he allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so they would search for God and perhaps fumble about for him and find him, though indeed he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we too are his offspring. Since we are God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like silver or gold or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of mortals. While God has overlooked the times of human ignorance, now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will have the world judged in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed, and of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead."
Now, Reverend Dr. Scott Rennie's sermon entitled The Unknown God.
All the talk now in the church scene on both sides of the pond is of what has become known as the quiet revival. This is the sense that among Gen Z and some millennials, there may be signs of more engagement with church in the last few years, and at that, particularly with churches that find themselves to have more traditional and ritualistic forms of worship, or, as we would say in Britain, churches that are higher up the candle. It's likely too early to say how large a demographic shift this is, or how significant it will be in the long term, except to say that there is some evidence, and it has been widely reported in the press, that there is a gentle and quiet upturn in forms of Christian worship with a more traditional aesthetic to them. Could it be that in a time of rampant individualism, rapid change, and increasingly atomized communities, traditional churches offer an antidote of meaning beyond the self, a sense of continuity, and a community with a narrative that takes us beyond ourselves back to a communitarian ethic? As a pastor of what is known as the High Kirk of Edinburgh, I would like to think so, but then I would. Anecdotally, I do see increasing numbers of younger adults at our high Presbyterian liturgical worship. I have no idea whether they come with a high sense of certainty about who they believe God to be, or doctrinal certainty, but somehow I doubt it. I get the sense through conversation that they come seeking God and seeking for meaning in the liturgy and poetry of worship, in those spaces between word and sacrament where God is present, but perhaps not overly defined. In those spaces where there is room for wonder and wondering. Perhaps the most interesting and honest altar that Paul discovered whilst in cosmopolitan Athens was that to the unknown God. Despite all our human sophistication, scientific knowledge, and theological literacy, there is so much we do not really know or understand. The cancer diagnosis we cannot explain. The prayer that goes unanswered. The tragedy that shakes our certainties. The deafening silence at times of God. Instinctively, we are all people who crave certainty, but in truth, faith has always had an altar marked unknown. In Athens, Paul embraces this unknown and commends the Athenians for their spiritual searching and curiosity about the divine. Amidst their false idols, and we continue to have plenty of our own, Paul is drawn to their altar to the unknown God, as evidence of their earnest search for God and for meaning. He undertook his missionary journeys on the assumption that to be human was to search for God. In the Reformed theological tradition, the Reformer John Calvin shares with Paul this instinct about humanity. He wrote in his Institutes that there is within the human mind, and indeed by natural instinct, an awareness of divinity. Calvin believed that every human heart carries an awareness, however faint, that we belong to God. He also believed that every human heart carries an echo of God, a kind of homesickness for the one who made us. And yet the Reformed tradition also carries within it the affirmation that at the same time as there is the human search, God is sovereign, transcendent, and beyond our comprehension. That is, if God is truly God, there will always be more about God than we can ever truly master or understand. This is also important because it keeps our faith humble and prevents us from making idols of our doctrinal certainties. Christian history has so often been characterized by a lack of humility and the failure to acknowledge the contingency of our knowledge of God, which has led to conflict and exclusion so often within Christian communities and churches. At the same time, Paul does not say to the Athenians, "Let's keep God vague," but makes the bold and scandalous claim that a day has been fixed and an assurance has been given that God will be revealed in the one whom he raised from the dead, to draw all peoples from different creed and cultures to God's self, and to bring justice and judgment at the end of time. All this through Jesus Christ our Lord. And God is revealed in him and through him. But there will always be a part of God we cannot know or fully understand. There is always part of the divine that remains beyond us, yet before us. As the psalmist puts it, "You hem me in, behind and before, and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is so high that I cannot attain it." For Paul, the unknown God has a name. The Creator has acted. The mystery of God has stepped into history. Therefore, like the Athenians, we have no need for and ought not to worship false idols of power, status, or greed. These are but idols of human creation and selfish longing. No, our worship ought to be directed to the one who rejected all of these for the cross, and who was then raised to life and victory over all the suffering and evil that worship of these false idols brings to bear on us, on God, and on all of creation. Christian faith does not worship an abstraction or a God of human making. Instead, it proclaims that the unknowable God has made himself known in Jesus Christ, the one whose suffering love brings life and salvation to the world. But even here, and this is the nuance, resurrection is not proof in a laboratory sense. Resurrection is revelation received in faith. We might think of it like this. In Jesus Christ, God is revealed, but not reduced. God is known, but not contained. The risen Christ makes God known, yet God remains God. And there is nowhere clearer, really, than the life of Paul, who was formerly Saul, for the life and world-changing power that this revelation has in human lives. It is completely transformative. And yet faith is just that, faith. It is not constant certainty, but rather putting our trust in the unknown, who has become known in Jesus Christ. Faith is trust in the Christ who is with us and is for us, who walks beside us and accompanies us in life by his risen presence. Faith requires trust, and trust requires that not everything is visible or plain to sight. If everything in our lives were measurable, predictable, controllable, then there would be no faith, only management. But it is God, not we, who is sovereign, the Reformed tradition reminds us. Our human desire for certainty and control in life is understandable, and yet, like an unquenchable thirst, it can never be satisfied. There is something important about uncertainty within the life of spiritual search and religious practice. Humility before God is key. We know from our human history the terrors we have brought on one another because of overconfidence in certainties we have held about God. We know the exclusion, persecution, and suffering that has been wrought on fellow human beings through a lack of humility before the sovereignty of God. It's not that we can know nothing of God. We can and do in Jesus Christ. It's simply that we cannot fool ourselves into believing that we can ever know God so much that we somehow own God or can place God in a box of our own making, one which suits us. This is, in fact, nothing but idolatry. Keeping a place in our life of faith for the mystery of God and for God to always remain partly unknown to us could not be more important than in today's world, which, like the ancient Athenian marketplace, is a global marketplace of pluralities and of competing beliefs and ideologies. Part of being Christian is to live in the knowledge of the love and presence of Christ, knowing Christ is with us, but also humbly acknowledging what we do not know and can never know in this world. I think people, and not just young people, are rightly suspicious of Christian certainties rather than Christian faith. I understand the joy people find in worship that still has a place for wonder and wondering about that which remains always beyond us in some ways. Part of faith is learning not only to live with mystery, but to embrace it in our lives. Be that the mystery of suffering, the mystery of providence, or the mystery of grace. God is sovereign not so that we can explain everything away, but so that we can trust when we cannot explain anything. Friends, I think there is an altar in every heart marked unknown. Some fill it with anxiety, some with cynicism, some with control. Paul doesn't demolish that altar, he reinterprets it. The Christian claim is not that mystery disappears, but rather that mystery has drawn near. We do not worship what we do not know. We worship the one who has made himself known, and whom we will never exhaust.
Our preacher today was the Reverend Dr. Scott Rennie. For a free transcript of his sermon, The Unknown God, you can visit us online at day1.org. The line that is staying with me from Scott's sermon is, God is revealed but not reduced. That is so true. Now, if only I could say it with Scott's gorgeous Scottish accent, unfortunately, there is no chance of that. Friends, we would love to know what you think of Scott Rennie's message this week. And we'd love to know, actually, something else, too. Where do you listen to Day One? Are you in the car, at home with coffee, or out for a walk, or somewhere else? Here's why we ask. It really helps us understand how Day One fits into your life and how we can serve you better. Tell us why you listen, and even if there's a preacher you'd love to hear on Day One, we'd love to hear that, too. Leave us a voicemail anytime at 404-490-3354. That's 404-490-3354. We listen to your messages as a team, and hearing your voices reminds us who this ministry is for. You can also email me directly anytime about anything at host@day1.org. For more than 80 years, Day One has carried messages of hope into people's real lives, into cars and kitchens and walks and waiting rooms and quiet Sunday mornings. This ministry continues because listeners like you support it. If Day One has been meaningful in your life, we invite you to make a gift at day1.org/donate. Or you may mail your contribution to Day One, 4062 Peachtree Road Northeast, Suite A629, Atlanta, Georgia 30319. Thank you for helping us keep this ministry strong for the weeks and years ahead. Next week on Day One, for the 7th Sunday of Easter and Ascension of the Lord, Reverend Dr. Chris Holmes of North Avenue Presbyterian Church in Atlanta brings us a sermon entitled Jubilant with Joy. Preaching from Psalm 68 and 1 Peter 5, Chris takes on what he admits may be the most difficult psalm in the whole Psalter. Thank you, Chris. Along the way, he finds a God who rides the clouds, melts wickedness like wax, and still stoops low to care for the widows, the orphans, the prisoners, and the homeless. It's a sermon about durable joy, holy humility, and remembering, in good Reformed fashion, that God is God, and thankfully we are not. That's Reverend Dr. Chris Holmes next week on Day One. Oh, Scott, thank you so much for that sermon. I'm thinking about several bits. One of them is when you said, I think there is an altar in every heart marked unknown.
I think it's a place in us that marks what we don't know, what we are uncertain of, what we long to know in the deepest, both spiritual and emotional sense, but for which we are not sure there is an answer, if we're really honest with ourselves. And I think that altar is not a problem. I think that altar is God's gift.
Yes.
Because it is that place of not being certain, of yearning, of longing, of wondering if it will be all right, that actually helps us in our search.
So, Scott, your point about how resurrection is not proof in a laboratory sense, to what extent do you think, when you think about those 1.5 million visitors coming through your door, are we all looking for proof in a laboratory sense? Is that a problem we bring with us?
That's a great question, Katie. I mean, I suppose I try not to think, first of all, too much about what caricature people have of Christianity or Christians when they come into the church.
That's probably good.
Because, quite honestly, if they were having it from the modern media, it doesn't actually reflect most Christians I know. I mean, most Christians I know have very firm faith, but they don't have the kind of certainties and sort of very black and white approach to life and issues. And that is so often the caricature, the unbending caricature of our modern times. I think when I celebrate communion at the Holy Table in St. Giles, I believe Christ to be present. I mean, really present. When I say to people, Christ is here, Christ is present, I'm not really talking. I mean, I am at one time talking metaphorically in that he's not standing there, but not so, because I really believe Christ is present, spiritually and really present. So in that sense, I have much certainty. But I don't have so much certainty about what that is or who Christ is that I am absolutely prevented from thinking some more about what that means or how that is, or reflecting on other people's experience of that and their understanding of it. And that's what I mean about the certainties. I'm not suggesting that, one shouldn't have a sense of what you have faith in. All I'm suggesting is that sometimes when we lack humility in what we believe, we actually lock God in a box of our own making, and we actually deny the Spirit the opportunity to reveal Christ to us. And that really is counterproductive. And worse, we then, by setting up these idols of our own making about who God is, without any sense of contingency, we then say to people, well, if you don't quite share that, well, you're out. Again, it's back to this very in, out, draw a line. I just don't think that's what, and actually I don't think Paul was like that. I used to think Jesus was appealing and Paul was appalling. Back in the old day, I used to find Paul quite difficult. But the more I've got to know Paul through reading, not least actually through reading some Jewish scholars who try and come at Paul from a Jewish perspective and where he fitted in his context. I really
good stuff there, yeah.
Yeah, well, Daniel Boyarin, for example, I think is a fabulous writer on that. Daniel Boyarin really helped me understand that Paul was the fusing of this a sense of the God of Israel and how this God of Israel was for everyone, but also this Greek idea of everybody being brought into one. And, Paul's conversion was really going from this horrible persecutor to this realization that God had come in Christ in order that this oneness could be brought about through him and through the Jewish tradition. And I think that is a beautiful thing. So Paul actually, and you can't lift Paul out of his context either, but as far as he could be, he really was he was one for bringing people in. So he goes to Athens, and he doesn't go to chide them. He goes to find a way to appeal to them and say, actually, the gap between us is not so big. And that if you listen to me and I can reveal God to you through this Jesus Christ, actually, the way you think about God will be different, in that God isn't about power and status and wealth and all the things that people often assign to God, or, they want God to be, because they really want it for themselves. He goes and he says, actually, it's the crucified God, because the crucified God is the God who overcomes suffering and evil in the world that really we bring about through our sinfulness. So this is why I think there's a generosity about Paul that sometimes we moderns don't give him credit for. And I have committed that sin often, especially earlier in my life, I think, in ministry. And so I think this passage I just think it has so much to say for us, particularly in our context of post-Christendom. And again, I don't see post-Christendom as a bad thing. I think it's a good thing. I think we have been freed from Christendom.
And freed, perhaps, from the piece of Christian history that most confined us, which was back in the 300s, we became the religion of the empire. And boy, if we could loose those chains.
The problem with that is you become tied to a system and that you then cannot critique. Yeah. You become the system. You become too loyal to the system. We're back at the Scottish Reformation. Why do you have a separation of powers? So that you can step back from the system. And actually, the system can teach you something about you, but also you have that perspective of disloyalty, a healthy disloyalty to the system, from which you can use the gospel to try and suggest this could be shaped better.
Yes, love it.
I don't think that is I think that is a gift to the church. I just do not subscribe to all this doom and gloom about post-Christendom. I think in 200 years, people will look back and they will say, thank goodness.
Mm-hmm. And we will look to moments like Paul in the Athenian market when he's looking around and we think we have to overcome divisions today. My goodness, it's incredible. It's a Christian miracle in a lot of ways that those little house churches there in the first few hundred years of Christianity bloomed, and that they overcame just insurmountable, a lot of times hatred of one another. We cannot even sit at the same table, let alone be worshiping together. What?
Because we live also in this, a more pluralistic world. But let's be honest, we have a privilege that Paul and many of those early church people did not have. Now, I know that's not true in every part of the world, but certainly in the West, we have, nobody's coming after us physically. We have a privilege that, because of Christian history, that those people did not have.
Yeah.
And, so we are back in the melting pot of ideas. But I think sometimes this is one of the things that confuses me about particularly mainline Protestant denominations, is that there's a sort of, sometimes it's like we've taken a bad reaction to our loss of privilege. That means we then think the answer is to turn back on society, and to disengage from the marketplace. Paul would have had none of that. Paul was right out there in the marketplace, debating, discussing, provoking. And that's the kind of confidence I think we need to recover. A confidence with humility. It's not about lecturing people or about saying it has to be the way we want it to be. It's simply about having the courage of our faith and conviction to share our ideas in the public sphere without always believing they have to dominate the public sphere.
Beautifully put. So, Scott, your ministry has unfolded in your lifetime during intense debate in the Church of Scotland around sexuality and inclusion. How has that journey taught you patience, courage, how to manage denominational disagreement, the line between personal and professional, all kinds of things?
Oh, help,
Pick a color.
Katie. Good. Well, I think the answer is it's not been easy. I mean, obviously, I grew up in a very evangelical church background, which gave me a lot, but also, on the other hand, took away a lot from me. And that was partly space to explore my sexuality. I was in a very happy marriage that became very unhappy, and got to a point in my life where I was alone, divorced, and in my mid-30s, and I had been wrestling with my sexuality all my life, really, but managed to kind of put it away in the do not touch box. But I think the breakdown of my marriage and feeling that maybe if I was fortunate, I was kind of halfway through my life. I always remember listening to Radio 4, which I recommend to everyone across the world.
Radio 4.
Radio 4 is amazing. Anyway, it was Woman's Hour. I was making a cup of coffee. I've no idea really what they were talking about, except I was pouring my water from the kettle into my cup. And I heard this psychologist say, the things that people run from and run away from in their lives are really the things that run their lives. Ooh. And I just had this eureka movement. I thought, I have spent my entire life for perfectly understandable, good Christian reasons running away from this truth about myself. And actually, it's been a disaster. And I thought I was running away from it, but it's actually shaped the whole of my life. And I just reached a point where I always felt called to ministry. I had very sure affirmation of God's love for me and my relationship with Jesus Christ. And I thought, you know what? This is not about Jesus. This is about other people's inability to live with the thing that makes me different. It could have been anything else that was different about me, but it just happened in this case to be my sexuality. And I thought, I've got to come to terms with it for myself, for my own sanity, and if I'm going to have a happy life going forward. And I suppose that change meant that I then, funnily enough, met my now husband at the General Assembly. I know the irony. And so then we just started to have a life together, like any other happy couple would have a life together. And it's been a huge blessing in my life, I cannot tell you. But of course, there was a part of the church. I was called to a congregation in Aberdeen who knew all of this. They were perfectly happy, but there were other conservatives in the Presbytery who were absolutely not, because they felt, and they were right to be fair, that if this was allowed to happen in one place, instead of a kind of don't ask, don't tell environment, all things would become possible and the ecclesiastical roof would fall in and, well, of course. So anyway, the case went to the General Assembly. I think it was the first time in over 150 years that an individual call of a congregation to a minister had been stopped. Went all the way to the General Assembly, and of course it became a major cause célèbre and all the rest. And it's not something I ever sought out in my life, but it's not something I suppose that change and being part of that change is not something I was prepared to run away from either. And the strange thing is that now in the Church of Scotland, we're 15 years at least beyond the real crucible of that debate. And now LGBT people can be married in church. Most congregations in the Church of Scotland are open to ministers in same-sex partnerships or marriages. It's really become not a thing.
Not a thing.
It's really become not a thing, which I love. And it's very interesting to contrast that with our Anglican friends and neighbours south of the border, where they are still, all these years later going through all of this. And I just think it's so, from our viewpoint, from my standpoint, I think it's so unnecessary, because I guess there were many who said, the ecclesiastical roof is going to fall in if you go this progressive direction. And of course, it was all fear-based, and the roof hasn't fallen in at all. In fact, anything but. And we live in a church where there's still diversity of opinion. And there is there's a minority who won't and doesn't, but they're very much a minority. And they're not a persecuted minority. They get on with being them, and that's also fine. But, it's just so not a thing anymore. And I just think that's wonderful.
It is wonderful.
And I hope it gives hope to people in denominations where that wrangle still rumbles on, because really, once you get over the wrangle, it's fine.
Scott, thank you so much for being on day one. We are so thrilled to have you, and may your ministry just continue to flourish. We can't wait to watch.
Katie, thanks so much. It's been an absolute joy.
You've been listening to Day One, the voice of America's mainline Protestant churches for 80 years, proclaiming God's hope to a hurting and divided world. 80 years is a whole lot of Sundays, and we're grateful to God for every one. Day One is produced by the Alliance for Christian Media. You can visit us anytime at day1.org. Thanks for being with us. I'm Reverend Dr. Katie Givens-Keim. May the grace of God be with you on day one and every day yet to come.